The gavel struck the bench, echoing through the tense courtroom. All eyes were fixed on the defendant's table, where a young black teenager stood, unshaken, unfazed. Judge Patterson leaned back in his chair, a smirk playing on his lips as he studied the girl standing before him. "This is a courtroom, young lady," he scoffed, his voice dripping with condescension. "Not a school play. Are you seriously telling me you plan to represent yourself in this case?" A ripple of quiet laughter spread through the room. The attorneys seated at the prosecution's table exchanged amused glances. A few spectators whispered among themselves, shaking their heads in disbelief. Maya Brooks didn't flinch. She stood there, hands neatly clasped in front of her, her face betraying no emotion. She had heard it all before, the dismissive remarks, the snide jokes, the disbelief. But this moment was different. This wasn't just about proving herself. This was about justice. The judge let out a dry chuckle, shaking his head. "A child playing dress-up as an attorney? You really expect me to take this seriously?" He sighed, rubbing his temple. "Look, I don't know what kind of game you think you're playing, but I suggest you request a public defender before you embarrass yourself." More laughter, more murmurs. But Maya remained still, her steady gaze locked onto Judge Patterson. Then, in a voice as sharp as a blade, she spoke. "Your Honor, I believe that would be a decision for my client to make. And since I am the client, I'd like to exercise my constitutional right to defend myself." The room fell silent. The smug grin on Judge Patterson's face faltered for the briefest moment, but he quickly masked it with an exaggerated sigh. "Fine," he muttered, waving a dismissive hand. "Proceed. Let's see what kind of legal wisdom a high schooler thinks she can bring to my courtroom." Maya exhaled slowly, taking a step forward. When she spoke again, her voice carried a weight that didn't match her years. "First, let's address the burden of proof, which the prosecution has failed to meet. The claims against me are based on circumstantial evidence at best, and the legal precedent set in re Winship clearly states that in criminal cases, guilt must be proven beyond a reasonable doubt." A shift in the air. A few heads turned toward the prosecution. The lead attorney's brow furrowed. The judge's fingers drummed against the bench. Maya continued. "Furthermore, Fourth Amendment guarantees protection against unlawful searches and seizures. The prosecution's primary evidence was obtained without a proper warrant, violating my fundamental rights. I move to have it dismissed." A murmur rippled through the crowd. The prosecutor, a seasoned attorney with 2 decades of experience, suddenly looked uncomfortable. He quickly whispered something to his colleague, his demeanor no longer as relaxed as before. Judge Patterson straightened in his chair, his smirk completely gone. "And where exactly did you learn all this?" he asked, trying to mask the growing unease in his voice. Maya tilted her head slightly. "By reading, Your Honor. A lot." Silence. Someone in the gallery let out a low whistle. One of the clerks glanced up from her paperwork, intrigued. For the first time since the hearing began, Judge Patterson seemed at a loss for words. He shifted in his seat, then cleared his throat. "Continue," he said, this time without a hint of mockery. Maya nodded and turned her attention to the jury. She wasn't just arguing her case now, she was commanding the room. And one thing had become abundantly clear. She wasn't here to play. Before the courtroom, before the stunned expressions and whispered admiration, there was a little girl with an insatiable hunger for knowledge. Maya Brooks had never been an ordinary child. Raised in the quiet suburbs of Chicago by her grandmother Clara, she was the kind of kid who asked questions that made adults pause. She didn't spend afternoons watching cartoons or playing video games like other children. No. Maya's world was filled with words, Big, complicated, powerful words. At 7 years old, while most kids were struggling with chapter books, Maya was sitting cross-legged on the living room floor, flipping through her grandmother's old law textbooks, her small fingers tracing over dense paragraphs on constitutional rights and legal precedents. She didn't just read them, she devoured them. Clara would watch from her armchair, a soft smile on her lips. "You sure you don't want to go outside and play?" she'd ask, but Maya would only shake her head. "Not yet, Grandma. I'm at the best part." By the time she was 12, Maya had done something even her grandmother hadn't anticipated. She was debating college students, sneaking into open university lectures, sitting quietly in the back until the professor posed a question, and when she spoke, heads turned. Professors leaned in. And the students? They hated losing to a middle schooler. Despite her brilliance, Maya never sought the spotlight. She didn't want the kind of attention that made people stare, whisper, or expect too much of her. She was content knowing she had a gift and using it quietly, in ways that mattered. But life had other plans. One crisp autumn afternoon, Maya and Clara were at the corner store, stocking up on groceries. Clara inspected apples while Maya wandered the aisles, lost in thought. That's when she heard it, the sound of a woman, her voice trembling, her words desperate. "I have nowhere to go. Please, I've paid every cent on time. He's lying. I didn't violate the lease." Maya turned toward the checkout counter, where a woman stood clutching a small bag of bread and milk. Her face was etched with panic, her eyes red and weary. 2 little kids stood beside her, their tiny hands gripping the hem of her coat. The cashier, though sympathetic, only shook his head. "I'm sorry, Teresa, but if the landlord says you broke the lease, there's not much you can do." Maya stepped closer, listening. The woman, Teresa, was pleading her case, insisting that she had done nothing wrong, that her landlord was fabricating reasons to evict her so he could hike up the rent for new tenants. Maya's mind started working before she even realized what she was doing. She had read about cases like this. She knew the laws. And in that moment, she saw something that no textbook or lecture had ever been able to teach her. Real injustice. She walked up to Teresa and, without hesitation, asked, "Do you have copies of your lease and payment records?" Teresa blinked, startled. "What?" "Your lease, your proof of rent payments. If you have them, you might have a case." The woman looked down at her, clearly confused. "But you're just a kid." Maya smiled, that quiet confidence never wavering. "I've been told that before." Maya sat at the worn wooden dining table, papers spread out in front of her, scanning each document with the sharp focus of someone twice her age. Teresa sat across from her, clutching a cup of tea Clara had made, still unsure how she had ended up placing her fate in the hands of a teenager. Maya flipped through Teresa's lease agreement, highlighting clauses, cross-referencing them with rent receipts, utility bills. Every scrap of evidence that could prove the landlord's claims were fraudulent. The more she read, the more patterns emerged. "This doesn't add up," Maya muttered, tapping a line on the lease with her pen. "He's saying you violated the occupancy limit, but there's nothing here restricting your children from living with you?" Teresa leaned in. "So what does that mean?" Maya's lips curled into a knowing smile. "It means he's lying." She reached for a blank sheet of paper and, with swift, calculated strokes, began drafting a formal notice. The words came easily to her, strong, authoritative, the kind of letter that made people pay attention. By the time she finished, the warning was clear. If the landlord proceeded with the eviction, he would face legal action. 2 days later, the landlord laughed as he crumpled the letter and tossed it in the trash. Maya expected that. She had spent enough time reading about people like him, men who thrived on intimidation, who assumed no one would fight back. But she also knew something else. They only held power when no one challenged them. And so, Maya took the next step. With Clara's help, she guided Teresa through the process of filing a case in small claims court. It wasn't just about stopping the eviction anymore. It was about sending a message that people like Teresa didn't have to be afraid, that landlords couldn't manipulate the law for their own gain. Word spread fast. A 17-year-old girl was taking a landlord to court. Local reporters showed up at Teresa's apartment, cameras rolling as Maya stood in front of the building, explaining tenant rights like she had spent decades practicing law. Her calm, composed demeanor only fueled the intrigue. Some people called her a prodigy. Others scoffed, dismissing her as a kid playing lawyer. The landlord, once so confident, now looked nervous. And then, the court date arrived. Maya walked into the courtroom with Teresa beside her, their steps synchronized, steady. The weight of what they were doing pressed down on them, but Maya didn't waver. She had been preparing for this moment her entire life. Judge Patterson barely glanced up as he shuffled through his files, then frowned when he read Maya's name as Teresa's legal representative. He looked up slowly, taking in the sight of the teenager standing before him. "You must be joking," he muttered under his breath, shaking his head. Then, louder, "Miss Brooks, are you actually attempting to represent the plaintiff in this case?" Maya met his gaze without hesitation. "Yes, Your Honor." A chuckle rippled through the courtroom. The judge sighed, rubbing his temple. "You do understand the seriousness of this proceeding, correct? This isn't a school debate. This is a legal matter, not a—" He waved a hand dismissively. "Playground argument." Maya nodded, unfazed. "I understand, Your Honor. That's why I'm here." Judge Patterson leaned back, unimpressed. "This should be interesting." The prosecution smirked, confident they were about to dismantle whatever weak argument this so-called lawyer had put together. But Maya wasn't here to play games. She was here to win. The courtroom settled into an uneasy hush as Maya took a slow step forward, adjusting the neatly stacked documents in front of her. The landlord sat confidently in his chair, arms crossed, a smug grin tugging at the corners of his mouth. He had seen this play out before, tenants fumbling through their defense, desperate to hold on to their homes, only to be crushed under the weight of legal jargon they barely understood. But this time, it was different. Maya's voice was steady, clear, and precise. "Your Honor, the defense claims my client violated the lease by exceeding the legal occupancy limit. However, as you can see in Section 4, subsection B of the lease agreement," she flipped a highlighted page toward the judge, "there is no such clause. This argument is not just weak, it is non-existent." The judge blinked, his fingers tracing over the text. The landlord's attorney sat up straighter, a flash of uncertainty flickering across his face. Maya continued, her words slicing through the air like a blade. "Furthermore, the defendant insists that my client has unpaid rent. But I present to the court these receipts." She lifted a neatly organized stack of papers, which not only show every single payment made, but also prove that the landlord accepted them without dispute. Yet he is still attempting eviction, which directly violates 42 U.S. Code, Section 1437F, protecting tenants from retaliatory action. A few murmurs spread through the gallery. One of the reporters scribbled notes furiously, her eyes darting between Maya and the judge. Judge Patterson cleared his throat, flipping through the evidence. "Miss Brooks," he said slowly, his voice more measured now, "where did you learn all of this?" Maya met his gaze without hesitation. "By studying, Your Honor." The landlord's attorney scoffed. "This is absurd. She's reciting laws like she memorized them off Wikipedia." He turned to the judge. Your Honor, I have reason to believe this individual is misrepresenting herself. There is no way, no possible way, a teenager could argue a case like this. Maya smiled, a quiet, knowing expression. Would you like me to provide my credentials? The judge raised an eyebrow. Yes, Miss Brooks, I think that would be appropriate. She reached into her bag and pulled out a crisp, official-looking document. A clerk took it from her hands and carried it to the judge. The room fell into an eerie silence as he read the contents, his face shifting from skepticism to confusion. Then, shock. His hands trembled slightly as he set the paper down. The prosecutor leaned in, squinting at the document over the judge's shoulder. Then, he too, froze. Judge Patterson looked up, his voice quieter now. You passed the bar exam? The gasps that followed were audible. Reporters sat up straighter. Spectators whispered to one another in disbelief. Maya's smile didn't waver. At 16, Your Honor. I chose not to practice officially yet, but I assure you, everything I've presented today is legally sound. For the first time that day, the courtroom was utterly still. The landlord's attorney looked like he had swallowed his own tongue. The landlord, who had been leaning back smugly just moments ago, now sat rigid, his expression unreadable. Judge Patterson let out a slow exhale, rubbing his temple. This court is adjourned for a 10-minute recess, he muttered, slamming his gavel down. The moment he stood, the courtroom erupted into a frenzy. Reporters rushed to take notes, people whispered furiously, and the landlord's team scrambled, trying to make sense of what had just happened. Maya calmly took her seat, folding her hands in her lap, as the world around her reeled from the revelation. This was only the beginning. The whispers hadn't even died down when the courtroom doors swung open again. This time, the tension in the air shifted, not with awe, but with something darker. Two uniformed officers stepped inside, scanning the room before their eyes locked onto Maya. A smug grin stretched across the landlord's face as he stood, adjusting his tie like a man who had already won. Your Honor, his lawyer announced, his voice now laced with confidence. Before this case proceeds any further, we must address a very serious matter. We have reason to believe that the so-called evidence presented by Miss Brooks was fabricated. The murmurs in the courtroom rose again, this time sharper, heavier. The judge's eyes flicked toward the officers, then back to Maya. Maya remained still, watching the scene unfold as if she had already anticipated it. The taller officer stepped forward, his expression unreadable. Miss Brooks, we need you to come with us for questioning regarding potential falsification of legal documents. Teresa, who had been gripping the edge of the table in silent anxiety, gasped audibly. What? She whispered. No, this is a mistake. She didn't do anything wrong. Maya took a slow breath and stood, keeping her posture straight. On what grounds? She asked evenly. The officer hesitated, glancing toward the landlord's side of the courtroom. A formal complaint has been filed against you, alleging that the evidence you submitted was tampered with. We're required to investigate. Maya could feel every pair of eyes in the room burning into her, waiting for her reaction. Some looked triumphant, others skeptical. A few, like Teresa, were filled with outright panic. She met the officer's gaze and gave the faintest nod. I understand. However, I will not be answering any questions without legal counsel present. Judge Patterson, who had remained silent during the exchange, leaned forward, eyeing Maya carefully. There was no fear in her stance, no sign of panic or doubt. If anything, she looked mildly inconvenienced. A moment later, a firm voice cut through the tension. That won't be necessary. She's not going anywhere. The doors to the courtroom opened once more, and a sharply dressed older man strode in, his silver hair neatly combed back, his presence commanding the kind of authority that even Judge Patterson acknowledged with a slight nod. Clara, who had been sitting in the back, finally exhaled in relief. Maya turned toward the man and gave a small smile. "You're late, Mr. Harris, traffic," he said dryly before shifting his attention to the officers. "Now, gentlemen, let's talk about due process. You're attempting to detain a minor based on unverified allegations. Do you have a warrant? Any actual proof?" The officer hesitated. "Not yet, but—" "Then she's not going anywhere," Mr. Harris interrupted smoothly. He turned toward Judge Patterson. "Your Honor, my client has presented verifiable evidence with a clear chain of custody. If the defense wishes to claim otherwise, they are welcome to do so. With actual proof, not baseless accusations meant to intimidate a young woman who clearly knows the law better than most people in this room." Judge Patterson sighed, rubbing his temple. "Mr. Harris, if this is some sort of stunt—" "Not a stunt," he replied. "Just the law." Silence. The judge turned to the officers. "Do you have anything concrete?" The taller officer shook his head. "No, Your Honor, just the complaint." Judge Patterson exhaled. "Then unless you return with an actual warrant, Miss Brooks is free to go." The landlord's smug expression vanished. His lawyer shifted uncomfortably in his seat. Maya stepped forward, meeting the officer's gaze. "Thank you for your time," she said politely. "But next time, I suggest you ask for the real criminal in this case." The officers exchanged looks, then nodded before turning to leave. As soon as they exited, the energy in the courtroom shifted once again, this time back in Maya's favor. The landlord sat rigidly, his jaw clenched. He had thrown his best punch, and Maya was still standing. Just when the dust had started to settle, the landlord made his next move. As court resumed, his attorney stood with newfound confidence, holding a thick folder of documents in his hand. His smirk returned, his voice dripping with false concern. "Your Honor, in light of recent developments, we have come across new financial records that suggest the plaintiff, Miss Carter, has been less than forthcoming about her income. We believe this evidence is critical to the case." Maya's eyes narrowed. There was something off about his tone. Too rehearsed, too eager. Judge Patterson leaned forward. "New evidence?" he repeated, clearly unimpressed. "You were required to present all documentation at the beginning of these proceedings. Why am I just now hearing about this?" The landlord's attorney straightened his tie, feigning innocence. "We only recently obtained these documents, Your Honor. They show that Miss Carter has been receiving substantial payments from an undisclosed source, contradicting her claims of financial hardship." Maya remained quiet, studying the folder as it was handed to the judge. Teresa, beside her, looked pale. "What? That's not true," she whispered frantically. "I've never had any secret money." Maya gently placed a hand on Teresa's arm, calming her. "I know, but we're going to prove it." Judge Patterson flipped through the papers, his expression unreadable. After a long pause, he looked up. "Miss Brooks, have you had an opportunity to review these documents?" Maya stood. "No, Your Honor. This is the first time I'm seeing them." The judge nodded. "Then I'll allow you until tomorrow to examine the validity of this evidence. We will reconvene at 10 a.m. sharp." The landlord's attorney seemed pleased. The smug confidence radiating from the defense table made Maya sick, but she didn't let it show. Instead, she gathered the documents, tucking them under her arm before turning to Teresa. "Don't worry," she murmured. "If they're lying, we'll find out." That night, Maya sat in front of her laptop, the financial records spread out before her, highlighting inconsistencies, comparing them against Teresa's actual bank statements, but something wasn't adding up. That's when she picked up her phone and called the one person she knew could help. "Aaron," she said, as soon as he answered. "I need you." Aaron, her tech-savvy friend who had helped her dig through legal archives before, immediately caught the urgency in her tone. "What's wrong?" Maya quickly explained the situation, reading off transaction numbers and company names from the documents. "Something about this feels fake, but I need proof." Aaron was already typing. "Give me a sec." Minutes passed in silence. The only sound was the faint clicking of keys as Aaron worked. Then, suddenly, "Found something he said, his voice sharp. "Maya, these transactions, they're coming from a company called Harmony Solutions, except there's one problem." "What?" "It doesn't exist, at least not as a legitimate business. It's a shell company, registered under an anonymous LLC with no actual operations. And guess who it's linked to?" Maya already knew the answer. "The landlord," she whispered. "Exactly. He's been moving money through this fake business, fabricating transactions to make it look like Teresa has secret income." Maya leaned back in her chair, exhaling slowly. It was worse than she thought. "They really think they can get away with this," she muttered. Aaron snorted. "Not if you blow it up in court tomorrow." The next morning, Maya walked into the courtroom with her evidence, her expression unreadable, her confidence unwavering. As soon as the judge called the session to order, she stood. "Your Honor, I've reviewed the documents submitted by the defense." She took a slow breath before dropping the stack of files onto the table. "And I can say, with absolute certainty, they are fake." The room fell into stunned silence. The landlord's attorney immediately shot up. "Objection! That is a baseless accusation." Maya turned to him, completely unfazed. "Is it?" She slid another document forward. "Because I had these transactions traced. They come from Harmony Solutions, a company that, until yesterday, I had never heard of. But it turns out, it's not a real company at all. It's a shell corporation with no legitimate business operations. And who owns that shell company?" She paused, letting the weight of her words settle before she answered. "The defendant." The courtroom erupted. Judge Patterson held up a hand, demanding order, but his expression was different now, no longer just annoyed or skeptical. Now, for the first time, he looked angry. He turned to the landlord's lawyer, his voice sharp. "Do you have any explanation for this?" The attorney stammered. The landlord sat frozen, his smirk long gone. Maya didn't need an answer. She had just ripped their case apart. The courtroom was electric, the tension so thick it felt like the air itself was pressing down on everyone in the room. The landlord sat rigid, his face paling as Maya slid yet another document across the table, her voice steady, unwavering. "Your Honor, this is a forensic audit of the financial transactions the defense submitted as evidence. It shows, without question, that these payments were fabricated using a fraudulent shell company, owned and operated by the defendant himself." Judge Patterson adjusted his glasses, flipping through the pages. His jaw tightened. He didn't even need to look at the defense to know they were scrambling. Maya wasn't done. "These aren't just questionable transactions," she continued. "This is outright fraud. The defense has not only attempted to mislead this court, but they have actively tried to frame my client as dishonest in order to justify an illegal eviction." The landlord's attorney shifted in his seat, flipping through his own papers as if hoping to find something, anything, that could counter her claims. But there was nothing. The courtroom was dead silent. Then the explosion. "This is a setup!" The landlord shot up from his seat, his face red with fury. "She's lying! She's manipulating all of you!" His attorney reached for his arm, trying to pull him down, but the man was too far gone. You're all being fooled by some arrogant little brat who thinks she's smarter than everyone in this room, he shouted, jabbing a finger in Maya's direction. This is a disgrace. Bang! The sound of Judge Patterson's gavel crashing against the bench cut through the chaos. That is enough, the judge snapped, his voice commanding absolute silence. His glare shifted to the landlord. If you speak out of turn again, I will hold you in contempt. The landlord clenched his jaw, but finally sank back into his seat, his breath heavy, his confidence shattered. Judge Patterson turned back to Maya. Miss Brooks, you may continue. Maya took a slow breath and stepped forward. Your Honor, this case was never about a lease violation. It was never about unpaid rent. It was about power. She turned toward the jury, her voice filled with conviction. The defendant assumed that, because my client is a single mother, because she doesn't have legal experience, because she doesn't have resources, that he could exploit her, manipulate the system, and take away her home for profit. She gestured toward the landlord's table. And when that didn't work, he fabricated evidence. He attempted to intimidate the court. He even tried to silence me with false accusations. She let the words settle, then met Judge Patterson's eyes. But the law doesn't bend for men like him. The law doesn't make exceptions for greed. The law is here to protect people like Teresa Carter, people who work hard, who follow the rules, and who deserve a fair chance. She stepped back. And that is why I am asking this court to rule in favor of my client. The silence that followed wasn't just quiet. It was heavy. Judge Patterson exhaled slowly, then straightened in his chair. I've heard enough. The landlord's attorney looked like he wanted to object, but he already knew it was over. Judge Patterson adjusted his glasses and folded his hands together. Based on the overwhelming evidence presented, this court rules in favor of the plaintiff, Miss Teresa Carter. A gasp rippled through the courtroom, followed by quiet cheers. Teresa's hands flew to her mouth, her eyes filling with tears. But the judge wasn't finished. He turned his steely gaze toward the defense table. Furthermore, due to the submission of fraudulent evidence, intentional deception, and attempts to manipulate these proceedings, this case will be referred for further investigation. The color drained from the landlord's face. Maya stood still, watching as the reality of the verdict settled over the room. She had done it. She turned to Teresa, who looked at her with pure, unfiltered gratitude. We won, Teresa whispered, her voice shaky. Maya allowed herself a small smile. No, she murmured. We earned it. The moment the judge's gavel struck the bench for the final time, the courtroom erupted. Applause, whispers of disbelief, and even quiet cheers filled the air as people processed what had just happened. Teresa collapsed into her chair, covering her face as silent sobs of relief racked her body. Maya placed a steady hand on her shoulder, the warmth of victory settling into her bones. She had fought this battle with everything she had, and she had won. But the moment of triumph was short-lived. The courtroom doors swung open, and 2 uniformed officers entered, their faces unreadable. The whispers turned into full-blown chatter as they made their way toward the defense table. Mr. Reynolds, one of the officers said, his voice firm. Stand up. The landlord stiffened. His face, already drained of color from the verdict, twisted into something between fury and panic. You can't be serious, he muttered. The officer pulled out a warrant. You are under arrest for fraud, evidence tampering, and multiple counts of tenant exploitation. You have the right to remain silent. The courtroom erupted again, but this time in pure shock. Flashes of cameras went off as reporters scribbled furiously, capturing every detail of the downfall of a man who had spent years bending the law in his favor. Maya watched as the officers cuffed him. He turned, his furious gaze locking onto her. "This isn't over," he hissed. Maya tilted her head, her voice calm, unwavering. "It is for you." With that, the officers led him away, the heavy courtroom doors slamming shut behind them. The case was over. But for Maya Brooks, this was only the beginning. Within hours, her phone buzzed non-stop. News outlets were running headlines like "Teen Prodigy Exposes Corrupt Landlord and Maya Brooks, the young legal mind who shocked the system." But what surprised her the most were the messages. Hundreds of them. Emails, direct messages, even letters from people across the country. Some were from tenants who had been victims of similar landlords, desperate for advice. Others were from students who had seen the trial and felt inspired to pursue law. A few were even from attorneys, seasoned professionals who wanted to meet the girl who had just rewritten the rules of the game. One email stood out. "Dear Miss Brooks, my name is Laura Gonzalez. I've been fighting an illegal eviction case for the past year, but I can't afford a lawyer. I saw what you did for Teresa, and I was wondering, would you be willing to help me?" Maya stared at the message, her mind racing. She had done this for Teresa, but Teresa wasn't the only one. She closed her laptop, exhaling slowly. A legacy had been born, and she wasn't going to stop now. She turned to Clara, who was watching her with knowing eyes. "What are you thinking, sweetheart?" Maya smiled, a flicker of determination burning in her gaze. "I think it's time to help more people. If you enjoyed this story and want to hear more powerful narratives like this, make sure to subscribe to the channel. Hit the bell icon so you never miss an update, because justice, truth, and inspiration are just one click away.